Evet, tekrar hoş geldiniz. Bugün benim için çok özel bir gün. Size sebebini de söyleyeceğim. Hem sizlerle beraber olduğumuz için hem gönlümüzün çok derinlerinde yatan konuları paylaşma fırsatı olduğu için hem merkezin ve vakfın çalışmalarının meyvelerini görme fırsatı olduğu için hem de Willett'le beraber bunu yapma imkanımız olduğu için. Bazılarınız bilmiyor olabilir ama ben akademik kariyerime Walt'un departmanında başlamıştım. Yani başka beni işe alacak birisi bulunmadığı için Walt'a gitmiştim. O da ilk fırsatı vermişti. Yani bugün de hala beslenme biyokimyası profesörü olarak da çalışıyorum ama artık o ünvanımla tanınmıyorum. Biraz sonra Walt'a hem kendi yaşamı büyüdüğü yıllardan bugünkü hayatına kadar gelen yelpazede bir söyleşi yapacağız. Hem de beslenme bilimiyle ilgili belki konuşmalarda dile gelmeyen bazı soruları yanıtlamaya çalışacağız. Bundan sonraki kısmı tabii ki İngilizce olarak yapacağız. Tekrar hoş geldiniz. Umarım keyif alırsınız. So Walt, I was telling that many people may not know, but you were the first person to give me a job. And so I'm very grateful for that, and it's a special moment that we end up coming to our home country with you. And so for those of you who, I don't know if there's anyone here who do not know Walt, but he's a very extraordinary person, both as an individual and as a scholar. For example, Walt is the world's most cited scientist. I don't know what is the number of citations, but there are hundreds of thousands of citations to the thousands of papers that he has produced. He's very prolific in scholarly publication and also communicating the science into policy, translation, and the benefit of people. So it's very rare to find people who are so involved with the scientific part, but also so involved in transition of this into well-being of humans. So congratulations for that and welcome to our country. So I want to ask you about your growing up. So you, I know you grew up in Michigan, and so do you come from an academic family? Where did you get this idea of going into science and choose this as a way of living?
Well, thanks, Gokhan. Just as an aside first, that I should mention that it is true that I did hire Gokhan just after he finished his PhD at Harvard University, and it was pretty clear that he was very bright and was likely to be a star scientist in the future, even at that time. But in retrospect, that was one of the best decisions I ever made because he certainly accomplished that in a very short period of time. But also, I'm really grateful that that I didn't expect a side benefit was that I would meet many people from Turkey who are really wonderful people, and I had really not had that much contact with scientists from Turkey and people from that part of the world. So both as people he's brought to Boston, to our School of Public Health from Turkey, and also being able to come here, that's been a very grateful, a very wonderful side benefit of hiring Gokhan. So yes, that was a very good choice, I must say. But in terms of my own interest in science, our family, the Willett family, for generations has been dairy farmers in Michigan. And my father was the first one in the family to get a PhD and go into science. Of course, that meant in the Midwest doing research on dairy cattle reproduction, and which is very important. So I learned from the very beginning, living or visiting his laboratory, even at age 5, when they were doing over-transplantation and watching the first artificially inseminated mammal being born in our front yard. Of course, it was a calf from a cow. So that was always interesting to me. But then food has always been, for many years, a great interest too. At a young age, a family friend was a woman from India who was a nutritionist from World Health Organization. And it was always really interesting to hear her talk because she got to travel to many interesting countries and work on interesting problems, and that was fascinating to me. So wherever I've been, whether it be in undergraduate school where I studied food science or in medical school where I did a number of nutrition studies, I've been weaving nutrition into what I work. And in fact, I put myself through college, paid for my way growing vegetables in Michigan. So I actually sold tomatoes and corn to go to college. So it's been interesting to have nutrition as a thread because nutrition is an area that brings to one place virtually all kinds of science, and not just laboratory science or not just epidemiology, but social sciences, economics. Now, clearly, very major interactions with earth sciences as we see that the environmental impact of food production and the implications of our food consumption are the single most important factor probably in climate change. And so we're right in the middle of that issue too. So that really does make nutrition an incredibly interesting area. We're working at interacting with your group at the cutting edge of cell biology, but also dealing with global climate change issues at the same time. And this really does provide a very, very fascinating bridge among these different forms of science.
So you went to medical school in Michigan and then trained as a physician, then came to Harvard and switched into training in epidemiology. So how did that transition work for you? So why didn't you choose, for example, to treat patients, but thought that you would have a better impact by working on nutrition? And tell us also a little bit about your years in Tanzania in between.
Sure. That again, I did keep a thread of nutrition going even when I was in medical school. One of the student projects I did with another student was to do a survey of health and nutrition in a Native American community in the northern part of Michigan. And that was in the 1960s, and found that half of the adults had diabetes. And that just stunned me and really raised the question of what's happening? Why is that going on? And that was my very first publication. And since that time, it's been one of my big questions to pursue is to try to understand the reason why some populations have such high rates of diabetes. And I think we understand a lot of that now. There's clearly a susceptibility, but then imposed on that susceptibility is a combination of unhealthy diets and lower level of activity that will produce these very, very high rates of obesity. And in fact, that's what we see happening around the world now. It turns out it wasn't just in Native Americans in the northern part of Michigan. This is huge parts of the global population is undergoing the same experience. It happened, unfortunately, the Native Americans were received a big dose of unhealthy diet and unhealthy lifestyle, and that was the emergence of the first warning signs of what's happening globally at the moment. So that was really, even while I was in medical school, I think gave me a reason to want to pursue research, even though I did start off practicing in internal medicine and enjoyed that. But I saw patients and realized, I think practicing medicine, there are many people with diabetes, heart failure. We can help those people survive and improve the quality of life, but we rarely cure the underlying condition. And it really seemed like it would be important to understand how to prevent those conditions rather than to be treating them not as effectively as we would like to do. One of the projects I did in medical school was to work in Tanzania, and I really enjoyed working there. The country was very committed to public health, and so after completion of my residency, I took a job in Tanzania, starting off teaching internal medicine there at the university, but it just turned out that they needed someone with some public health training there to pick up community medicine. And I had done a master's degree in public health by that time. So I switched over and got more and more interested in epidemiology as a way of understanding the origins of disease and understanding approaches to controlling disease. So I realized how powerful epidemiology could be, and then realized it had really not been applied to nutrition very well. Partly epidemiologists were afraid of the complexity of nutrition, which is much more complicated than, say, smoking or some of the environmental or occupational exposures. Definitely nutrition is complicated. So I guess I was not...
leads me to an area, actually, it's very popular, and it's in everybody's mind. We know that. I mean, it's probably the most popular topic in the lay media. The public exhibits tremendous interest. Everything related to nutrition. There are thousands of books, programs, TV programs, and billions and billions of dollars spent on nutritional remedies. So is this really an area which can impact human life and well-being? So I like you, since you're here, I want you to maybe just tell us in a few examples, what is really the impact of nutrition in human life? What is, for example, your top 3 most impactful interventions that relates to nutrition?
Mm-hmm. Right. I think the impact of nutrition on human life and well-being is much bigger than I actually expected it to be when I started our work. From the beginning, the major focus was on heart disease. There were enough leads and clues to think, some of them I showed today, that diet was impacting heart disease in an important way. But again, when I started to look at the actual evidence, it was very, very weak and limited. And I realized we needed to have better, stronger evidence. And it has turned out that nutrition has a very big impact on heart disease, but in different ways than was expected and that people believed in the 1970s, where it was thought that saturated fat was the whole part of the picture, and trans fat was not even considered at that time, or considered a distraction. And it's turned out that the impact of diet on nutrition has been much more complex. It's not just saturated fat it's a part of the picture, but it's a weak, small part of the picture. Trans fat's much more important, and we've accomplished a lot in reducing that. The unsaturated fats are really very strongly beneficial for cardiovascular disease. Fruits and vegetables, people were not talking about at all, have an important benefit for many different reasons for cardiovascular disease. And the form of carbohydrate is also very important. So, as I mentioned, we put all these together, and it's pretty clear that we can get down to the levels of the Mediterranean countries in terms of the 1960s, with very low rates of heart disease, without having to be peasants running up and down mountains and things like that. You can do it in the context of a 21st century lifestyle if we make the right choices. But beyond that, nutrition has turned out to be important for many things I had not even thought of at the beginning. It's not primarily our work, but the fact that with a multiple vitamin or adequate folic acid, you can prevent 70% of the most serious common birth defect, neural tube defects, by just that single nutritional factor. If people had told me that 40 years ago, I would have said, they're nuts. But it's true, and it's very firmly documented. And or that diet during high school could be influencing risk of breast cancer decades later was not something that anybody was thinking about, I think, during that period. And now we're looking at the later period of life, where because we've been able to prevent heart disease and cancer to a large degree, we're living longer and developing dementia, Alzheimer's disease. And we're starting to look at how nutrition influences that process, and it appears very powerfully. Things, again, outcomes that we had not really thought about much also seem to be strongly influenced by diet. So it's been an incredibly exciting experience. There's various ways levels of looking at this that are useful. All of them are useful. We can look at whole foods. We can, and that does include the fact that foods are very complex and contain not just essential nutrients that we study, but all kinds of phytochemicals that have appear to have many important biological effects.
It's also a dynamic process.
Absolutely. So then we can look at all the way down to your level, looking at what goes on inside the cell, and that's also informative. So I think it's very helpful to look at the problem through these different lenses and then try to put all the pieces together to have the maximal understanding and the most effective preventive strategies.
But then let me ask you, for example, we know, I think I may have learned this from you, but in a recent talk, I gave the example that in a cup of coffee that we all love here, I mean, you can find 6,000 to 8,000 different molecules just in a cup of coffee. And of course, this reflects the history of that coffee, where it grew and under what circumstances, in which era. So in talking about nutrition, is, for example, an apple, which we see beautiful pictures of here, is the apple we eat today, is it the same apple that our grandfathers or even further ancestors ate? So does nutrition or nutrients themselves evolve over time? And how do we really adjust our recommendations based on the changes that happen in the agriculture, atmosphere, ecosystem, and so on?
Yeah, that's why we're going to be in business for quite a while, because it's not, as you say, it's dynamic, it's not static. And very few foods are actually the same foods that previous generations consumed. One of the very few foods, very, very few wild fish, wild blueberries. It's a very small number of foods have not been altered by human selective breeding long before modern genomic technologies occurred. The corn, of course, was very carefully evolved by the Native Americans from ordinary grass to something that actually is probably the most efficient producer of calories per land area. And many times the motivating factors for selective breeding were not directly or necessarily related to human health. They were mostly related to yield and maximizing caloric production. So we sometimes can lose valuable traits that way. And almost for sure, in many cases where we've promoted yield, in the grains, for example, have expanded the endosperm, and therefore the ratio of essential nutrients, which are not mostly in the endosperm, has been going down with time. And I think that actually is a problem, that we're now in a situation where obesity and diabetes are a problem. Having that massive amount of carbohydrate in relation to the nutritional value is, we probably created some problems by the selective breeding. In the dairy industry, my father's work, it's amazing that the cow today is producing about 5 times more milk than the cow of 1940, mostly through selective breeding, but also selective nutrition and other factors involved in milk production. We don't know exactly what changed. It was very, very empirical selective breeding until recently, and what genes, what genetic variants were actually selected for in boosting that yield. And it's a little worrisome. Almost for sure they were hormone related, and some of that may not necessarily be desirable. So we're now, I think, sort of working backwards to figure out in this process of selected breeding what gain of function happened, what loss of function happened, but for sure the milk is not the same now that milk produced 40 or 50 years ago was.
Yeah, so I mean, I wanted to also hear from you. These are, for example, even difficult for people who study the biochemistry of this and molecular mechanisms of this, let alone for the lay people to really put together in a comprehensive picture. So there is a lot of information coming from every direction. You mentioned a little bit about this during your talk. And so how does someone in the street make the choices? Which information is correct? Which information is reliable? Which information is science-driven? So how does the science of nutrition compete with other media outlets pouring information from every direction?
Right. This is a huge problem that I alluded to very briefly there, that there is an overabundance of information, which should be making us smarter, but it seems to be making us more confused, I'm afraid. And that's the message that I'm hearing from people, because so much of that information that the general public hears is confusing. And part of this is, there have been, we talked about this a little bit, some failures in the review process, and that some of the very best journals have published some very misleading papers on artificial sweeteners, on saturated fat, on health effects of obesity even. And that's unfortunate that our process is allowing that to happen. Eventually in the scientific area, I think the good thing about science is that it, over the long run, is self-correcting. There will be other studies that will not confirm some of that misleading information, or it will be refuted. And that is the best thing about the scientific process, that it is back and forth, and eventually we do arrive at closer and closer to the truth. But in the process, the public can easily get confused. And unfortunately, the public is often seeing the single latest, most sensational story, when it's really, that's the information that's most likely to be incorrect. And the most likely information is the paper that isn't necessarily in the top journal, but it's a third paper confirming an original finding. And by that time, when there's been enough confirmation, findings are really strong scientifically. Now, we theoretically have some processes that do attempt to look at all the available evidence and look at it all at once and look at information, identify the information that's consistently supported by different studies, ideally different kinds of information. Like with trans fat, we had multiple studies showing, controlled feeding studies showing adverse effect on blood lipids. We had multiple prospective epidemiologic studies showing adverse relationships with heart disease, and you put that together and it becomes makes a very strong case.
But who transmits that information?
Yeah,
in the end, people in the street need to hear, okay, you should eat this, you should stay away from this.
Yeah.
So where do they get that information?
That is the problem. Now, ideally it comes from reviews, like we have the National Dietary Guidelines Committee. Every 5 years in the US, there is a formal committee put together to review all the evidence on diet and health. And they should put together that summary that is the most reliable information. But as I showed in my early studies, unfortunately, committees are made up of humans. We're all fallible. And sometimes those committees are selected with a goal. One thing that you learn in government is if you want to get a result, you select the committee to ensure that you will get that result. And I've been barred from being on those review committees, interestingly. But fortunately, other department members have been part of that process. And I think, each time the committee has met over the last 5 years, over the succeeding 5 years, the guidelines have become more and more scientifically based. So I think the latest review in 2015 is actually a pretty close, not perfect, but getting closer and closer to a strongly supported body of scientific information.
So let me challenge you on that.
But I would say that those reports, even to the extent that they're imperfect, often get much less publicity in the public media than the sensationalized story of always man-biting dog is a bigger story than dog-biting man. And the public hears about man-biting dog, not the other stories. So that's part of the problem. And I think meetings like this, which are attempt to bring together multiple people from a strong scientific basis, are very important. And I think journalism, journalism on nutrition overall has gotten better, but in the U.S. I think, more so in the magazines, I find, where there's not pressure to get a story out the next day, like in newspapers, where there can be a more in-depth review of, an in-depth reporting. But I must say it's very sad that some of the newspapers have turned to going for sensationalism, and the worst is actually the New York Times. That is completely unreliable in the area of nutrition and health writing. They seem to not take it seriously, and that's unfortunate because it is the leading newspaper in the United States, and people think they're getting reliable information where even that has become unreliable. So it's a big challenge. And the internet, of course, has caused anybody can say anything on the internet without review. So that's one reason we have set up our website, Nutrition Source, which is a real attempt to provide information on nutrition and health based on the best available evidence for the general public. So there are some processes, and there are some other sources that are trying to do that, but it is a serious problem. The average person cannot help but be confused given what they're seeing on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, so there's another side to that coin also. I wanted to hear there's a general trend in the world that people have difficulty in believing in scientific evidence. And I mean, this is a huge challenge for every field. And sometimes a good story actually can make people convinced to a certain truth than a mountain of evidence. For example, climate change. There is enormous amount of evidence, but I mean, if you give an example from America, the parliament is full of politicians who say there's no climate change, and whatever it is, it's just natural fluctuations. Or we find groups now promoting skepticism about vaccination, which is one of the man's history's most successful public health intervention. And so why is this? Why do people have difficulty in believing in evidence and science? And do you see this also the case for nutrition? Is it because the science is not good or the evidence is not strong? Or even in cases where it is very strong, people sometimes refuse to believe in it?
Yeah. It's a huge problem. Essentially, dismissal of science even. And it's happening in so many areas. And I think some of it is, unfortunately, there's an active campaign to discredit science in some circles because it's inconvenient. And we saw that, of course, with tobacco. We've learned a lot from the tobacco issue in public health, that for many years, the tobacco industry denied any adverse effect of smoking. And tried to discredit scientists, tried to discredit information. You could always find someone in the scientific community. There's enough people, you'll always find one or two that will be willing to go forth and say, as a scientist, it's not credible information. And so this is a strategy that's now being used by climate change, and obviously the oil and coal industries are supporting a lot of this. And some of it is a lot just to create doubt and skepticism, and or even to say, well, we don't know, but more research is needed, therefore delayed any action. That's a common strategy as well. So we've seen that definitely in multiple areas. But some of it is just craziness that I don't understand. I'm not a psychologist, but I don't think there's any economic reason to be against vaccination, for example. It's not a conflict of economic interest there. And I'm not sure what the motivating factors are in that case. But I think this is worrisome because if we don't have science, we don't have a means of resolving disagreements. We're essentially based on evidence, and it is a process, and at points in the process there's ample room for genuine disagreement about the strength of the evidence or the kinds of evidence that we give more weight to. But again, science is a process, and we eventually, I think, can get to a point where we have very powerful evidence. Now, in many areas, we will never have absolutely conclusive, perfect evidence. As I mentioned, in most areas in nutrition, the ideal study is not possible to do, where you randomize infants at birth to different diets and you look at the lifetime impact. You can do that in your laboratory with a mice, but we can't do it in human populations. And but still, it's very normal that we make decisions without the theoretically perfect information. that the legal system, of course, is not based on experimental randomized trials, where you put together all the information and make life and death decisions on the weight of overall evidence. You want a high level of certainty before making a serious decision for death or serious penalty. But of course, in the area of climate change, we can never do randomized trials.
So people need to believe.
But we can have very, very powerful information where you have multiple studies and different kinds of information. And I think it is important that we include scientific education in our school. In the area of nutrition, it's really important to educate our children, the whole population about what we should eat. But it's actually also important, and maybe this is something for the foundation to be thinking of in future years, to be educating our children about how we learn about what a healthy diet is. What is the scientific basis of a healthy diet? And I think you can make my talk a little bit more simpler that school children can understand.
But is it more important to teach them the actual didactic information about food or habit? Or is it equally important to teach them how to evaluate the evidence? So how to make a decision, how to think scientifically?
I think it's equally important, and maybe even the process, not just the conclusion, but the process of how we think is even perhaps even more important, because it applies to almost everything in life. And of course, we are in an environment where everything is changing much more rapidly. Our environment is changing more rapidly than we could ever imagine. Technology has really revved up everything, and if we're going to, both for making individual decisions about a person's lifestyle choices, but also as a society where we're making societal decisions or not making them in a context where that's changing very rapidly. If we don't make good decisions, this can have catastrophic effects, and I think climate change is one important example. So to understand the process of collecting evidence, interpreting evidence, is very important if we want to have a democratic society that survives, basically.
So let's talk a little bit about where do we go from here. Again, in the context of maybe nutrition. So there's a huge amount of exciting scientific developments in life sciences, in engineering, in analytical sciences. I mean, right now, recently I just read a robot which can distinguish wine better than the connoisseurs, just based on mass spectroscopy. So how is science going to integrate with practice in this context, looking into the future? Or maybe more specifically, do you think, for example, we can make medicines out of nutrients? So can we extract whatever is good in fish and provide that or analyze and discover new things that we don't know? Do you see this as a possibility, or where do you see the future of science and nutrition?
Yes, that's a good question. And the technology, as you say, is becoming very, very powerful. Of course, we're already doing what you say. We're extracting elements of foods and making them into pills. And some of that can be valuable, like folic acid supplements, for example, or folic acid fortification of food is being effective in helping prevent birth defects. And there is always this tension within the nutrition community. Do you want to get all the molecules of value from eating whole foods, or can you make supplements and get some of them that way? And I think we should have an open mind about that, because in some situations it may be very difficult to get everything from food. And that's going to become more of an issue if we look into the future. By 2050, the population in the world is going to be somewhere between 9 and 10 billion people. We're already not feeding them very well, and our resources are being stressed seriously and the environment is being degraded even at present, not feeding the present 7 billion people adequately. So that's going to be a huge challenge to not just feed that 9.5 billion people, but to feed them a healthy diet. So I think we are going to have to rely on technology. I think GMOs are an important issue. It's just a technology, but if we can use that to make crops more drought resistant in parts of Africa that are getting drier and drier, that may be pretty important to maintain a food supply. So there are some things we can use technology for good and bad, of course, but there's some, I think, potentially important applications. But I do get concerned. Was that movie Soylent Green popular in Turkey in the past? I don't know if you saw that. Well, it was a movie. I guess maybe it's my age, but it was a movie about New York in 2025, not so far away, where essentially people were eating just an industrial fake diet instead of real food. That was, in fact, what you're describing was sort of an artificial compilation of macronutrients and micronutrients called Soylent Green. And there actually is a product out there now that is artificially synthesized fatty acids. And this is technology that's there and happening. I do worry about it, though. There has to be concern because, as you say, that cup of coffee with 6,000 molecules in it, we don't know the function of all those 6,000 molecules and what the optimal dose and amounts are for them. It's turned out coffee is a pretty healthy substance, and it can actually reduce diabetes risk and have reduce gallstone risk and some other things too. We're not sure exactly why.
It's great news for us.
Sure. It's definitely good news for a lot of people. So making artificial foods where we don't really understand all the constituents, it's very easy to imagine that we could leave out some important elements, some of the important molecules, or put too much of some other maybe toxic compounds in it that might be very hard to discover the subtle toxicity that occurs over decades. It took us about 100 years to discover that trans fat was a problem, actually. So it's a little sobering how long that took. So we could make some bad mistakes. But so I think but at the same time, we shouldn't take that technology off the table. I can imagine some uses of some of these synthetic oils, perhaps for cooking purposes, or perhaps for animal feed, that might be useful, but would be pretty careful about switching people over to totally synthetic diets. But on the other hand, you look at places like India that they're adding 30 million people a year, not adequately feeding the present population. We need to, I think, keep all technologies on the table to be able to, I think that we can feed the world's population in a healthy way in 2050.
I think we're coming to the end of our time, Willett, but I want to ask you a few more questions to reflect while we're winding down here. I mean, one is, of course, I have known you for a long time now. Even in that period of time, the changes in science is enormous. I mean, everything becomes out of date in very, very quick time. We gather a lot of information, and we produce a lot of recommendation, but people continue to do things that they know, even with the existing information, they know that's not good for them. So how can we be more effective to stimulate people to make the right choices and right decisions? And why is it so difficult to change? Because everything you said in your talk is promoting change, but even the smallest increment of change is very, very difficult. So can you reflect on this very briefly?
Yeah, I could reflect on it very lengthily, but basically, I think that's why that socio-ecological model that I talked about a little bit is helpful to realize that there are many, many places where we need to make change, and that list of 8 simplified list of 8 areas is helpful to me as a sort of check-off list, and there's no one solution there. We need to be taking action at all of those different levels. And it also depends on what change we're trying to make. Some change can be, we can fix the product at the beginning, like trans fat, that essentially we don't have to depend on individual decisions to make some of these changes, where we can make the products, make foods healthier right from the very beginning. Lots of examples of that. We can work with the schools, as being done by the Sabri Alkor Foundation in a very important way. At work sites, all of these areas, we see we can make change. So I'm optimistic that it's possible, but at almost every level, sometimes there are competing interests, often commercial interests, that we need to sometimes work with, sometimes we need to work against them. So it is a complex process. But on the average, we have been tracking diet quality in the United States. We recently published a paper, and on average, it slowly is getting better, despite despite lots of the challenges. But a very important issue is when we break it down by socioeconomic status, the improvement is all in the upper income, upper educated groups, and at the lower income education groups, there's been no improvement at all. So the gap in 10 years doubled. And I think that is a huge, huge challenge for public health and just equity in principle, that we are in some ways going in different directions from a nutrition standpoint. And we see that being directly translated into health and mortality statistics as well. So that I think is one of the very biggest changes, and that gets at it's societal priorities. For us, it's very important to describe what's going on, but it will have to be societal changes that will address that problem. And I think it is a worrisome problem because as those gaps get increased, increased social stability becomes, I think, not viable. So we really, goes well beyond nutrition, but we see that happening very much looking at this through a nutritional lens. So that's one of the huge challenges.
No, it's very central, actually, I think, to our country, because there's good news and bad news at the same time. Because in Turkey, 1/3 of the population are students. I mean, this is an enormous number. And so that means if you incorporate the appropriate learning experience into each element of the school experience, you can actually produce an enormous impact. And the population is very young, therefore. But the bad news is, of course, the same gap of economic opportunity also exists here in a growing manner. So the upper percentile is becoming more smaller, controlling more of the wealth. And the wealth distribution problem is, I think, a global problem, promoting public health challenges. Thank you very much, Walt. This was a very inspiring conversation, and thank you for spending some time with us. And if you have questions for Walt, he'll be around to answer your questions. And hopefully you'll enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Thanks.